On 100.9 WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Evidence of Design. I'm your host, Jason Taylor, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Matt Treadwell.
Hello.
And special guest, Graham Hughes.
Hi, everyone.
This is our 6th episode of Evidence of Design. You can listen to our past shows on YouTube by searching for the Evidence of Design channel. Also, you can email us throughout the show at evidenceofdesign101@gmail.com. We're trying to have a more open discussion this week, so we're encouraging those of you who are listening to call in at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. If you have any questions or a thought that you'd like to contribute to the conversation, we'd love to hear it. Last week, Matt and I spoke at length about the ongoing scandal involving Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, and the 2016 Trump campaign. Today, we'd like to investigate some of the broader implications generated by that debacle. Chiefly, why? Why should I care what Facebook and other social media sites do with my data? How do the actions of Cambridge Analytica affect me? But before we jump into that, I'd like to give a brief recap of our last episode for those who might have missed it. Like, what is Cambridge Analytica? Well, it started as a shell company under a London-based company by Strategic Communication Laboratories. Cambridge Analytica was founded by wealthy conservative donors, Robert and Rebecca Mercer, who, as it appears, wanted to create an organization that could leverage data to make political advertising in order to advance their political agenda. In 2014, Cambridge Analytica enlisted Dr. Alexander Kogan, a researcher at Cambridge University, to obtain the data of what is now estimated to be 87 million Facebook profiles. Dr. Kogan exploited a flaw in Facebook's third-party app system that allows him to access the data of consenting users, and this is important, also their non-consenting friends. Cambridge Analytica used that data to create psychographic profiles, frighteningly accurate character portraits gathered from seemingly disparate data. They then used those psychographic profiles to create targeted ads in order to influence the outcome of the 2016 presidential election. First in service of Ted Cruz, then Donald Trump after he secured the Republican nomination. Although news of Cambridge Analytica's work broke in 2015, the story gained mainstream attention on March 17th of this year when the New York Times published a blockbuster article on Cambridge Analytica's work, this time with extensive information from interviews with one of its ex-employees, Christopher Wiley. Since that article was published, the CEO of Cambridge Analytica, Alexander Nix, has stepped down, the CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, has testified before Congress, and the debate on the use of data in the 21st century has gained public attention. So today, we're going to talk about why this matters. With the endless tide of news and the onerous crush of trying to understand it all, why talk about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook? Matt and I believe that the implications of this story have a profound impact on our ability to live together as citizens in a deliberative democracy. The collection and the use of big data, the moral and ethical obligations of the companies that profit off this data, and the production and spread of fake news are all serious issues that we, as a society, must devote ourselves to. So we hope you join us in this conversation today. Let's take it away. All right, so that was a quick recap on Cambridge Analytica. And again, You can find our past episodes on YouTube by searching for the Evidence of Design YouTube channel. We are not hot enough as a show to be on top of the search result engine, but if you search something like Cambridge Analytica gun violence, which was one of our past episodes, I'm sorry, not Cambridge Analytica, Evidence of Design gun violence, our YouTube channel will come right up and you can kind of catch yourselves up on that. So real quick though, we did mention psychographics. Psychographics was a really important part of this whole Cambridge Analytica story. Matt, do you want to remind listeners what psychographics are and why they're important to this discussion?
Sure. I mean, you kind of touched on it briefly in your recap, but basically psychographics are using seeming bits of data that seem inconsequential probably to the average observer, like what candy bars you like to eat, or what clothing brands you shop at, and being able to take weird bits of data like that and able to paint a portrait or a profile of somebody that is able to predict their political leanings, their demographic, and other such information that, you know, you would seemingly not be able to glean from this sort of thing.
And we mentioned last time that psychographics, everything you just mentioned, Matt, is different than demographics. And this is a new phenomenon because of information technology, because of social media, because of big data. We now have the ability to gather all these different bits of information about people that we never had before. Before, if you're a political campaign and you want to target ads to someone, you somehow collect demographic information such as age, sex, gender,
employment,
where
you shop at.
Right, and if you can get that though, right? Because back in the 1950s or something, I mean, how would you figure out where someone shopped at?
I don't know. I don't have that information on me.
Right. So maybe they do surveys or political polling or something or some sort of information. But nowadays there's something called the like button. And the like button is a really, really profoundly important part of this psychographic sort of story that we're talking about, because although it's not a hard piece of data that you might think, every time you like something on Facebook, it provides a data point. Provides a data point for the way that you look about the way that you see the world and the things that you're interested in. And adding on all of your little likes on top of that demographic information produces these psychographic profiles that companies and political organizations can use to try to target specific advertising towards you to get you to act a certain way. And that's really, I think, at the heart of this matter. There's a lot going on with the story, but that ability to do that and the moral and ethical responsibilities that abound within this whole phenomenon here is, I think, the most important part of all of this. So, again, our focus on today's show is to continue discussion about Cambridge Analytica, and we really want to answer, why does this matter? We didn't get to last time talking about some of the clips from members of Cambridge Analytica. Channel 4 is a news organization in the UK, and reporters from Channel 4 were undercover and gathering information, essentially recording conversations with various high-level leaders in Cambridge Analytica for a few months. They were doing that before the story broke on March 17th here in the New York Times.
Right.
And the stories came out around the same time.
Within like 3 days of each other. And actually, supposedly, Channel 4's piece is what got Alexander Nix suspended originally from as CEO of Cambridge Analytica.
Absolutely. So we'll play just a few clips here from the Channel 4 reporting on Cambridge Analytica. And I think these clips are effective at least making us ask and wonder, okay, yeah, maybe this is important, and why should we care about it? So, Matt, if we want to play one clip here on really what does Cambridge Analytica think about what elections are all about?
Lesson in modern electoral tactics.
The two fundamental human drivers when it comes to taking information on board effectively are hopes and fears, and many of those are unspoken and even unconscious. You didn't know that was a fear until you saw something that just evoked that reaction from you.
Right.
And our job is to drop the bucket further down the well than anybody else to understand what are those really deep-seated underlying fears, concerns. There's no good fighting an election campaign on the facts, because actually it's all about emotion.
Graham, what do you think? There's no good fighting an election campaign based upon the facts. It's all about fear and emotion.
Well, I think that's a very negative view to take of humanity, and also a very negative way to approach electoral politics. You know, I'm of the belief that the best politics are the politics based on hope and love for other people, and that just seems so counterproductive to that.
Matt, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I should just mention real quick that was from Mark Turnbull.
Great.
He is Cambridge Analytica's managing director. At least he was at the time that video was taken. I don't know what his position now is within the company, or if he's even with them anymore. But yeah, I totally agree with Graham. But I think that, like, even more so, when you live in a democracy, it's necessary to agree on a baseline of truth and facts. And if we don't sort of maintain a level of decency and fairness and openness, then the whole system falls apart, and it's so easily abused by people who would, I guess, neglect those values.
He does make I do kind of have to agree that elections today in America and for some time have been mostly based on emotion, though. I think he's right about that. But that speaks to deeper structural and systemic issues that we face, about why when Hillary Clinton gets up there and talks about all these crazy policy, wonky ideas that she has based on factual information, people just fall asleep.
I think that's true. I mean, I think, it's an apt sort of observation to make, that elections are run on emotion, but I think we should strive for them not to be.
I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. I know I get frustrated when election seasons are bound, and anytime, for example, gun violence comes up, it comes immediately, the issue becomes the left is trying to steal your guns, and you never actually get to talking about the issues. And I know Matt and we did a few episodes on gun violence, hoping to get to some sort of, I don't know if I want to say fact, but some sort of actual policy implications. And
we wanted to have a discussion that we felt wasn't being had in the media. It was always, should there be a discussion on gun violence or on gun control? And we just wanted to talk about, like, what are some things that we could do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so gun violence is a great example of it immediately going towards emotion. Maybe abortion is one of those issues that might go right to emotion. Maybe healthcare is one of those issues as well, where I don't know how well versed the American public is on the actual policy implications of healthcare.
I would say probably not well.
Healthcare is a very complicated and confusing issue.
I know I'm not.
Yep, I'm not well versed either.
Gun violence is a really interesting one to me because we want to have fact-based conversations about gun violence, but we don't have a lot of factual evidence about gun violence. The American government isn't allowed to study it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just very interesting.
Right. And that might have just changed with the new budget deal that passed in Congress where they reversed the Dickey Amendment.
Yes.
That might have just changed.
But that was like for 20 years.
Yeah, 20 years. Yeah.
About the case where, it wasn't that they weren't allowed to study gun violence, but it was heavily sort of implied that it was something not to do, basically.
Yeah. Perhaps the same way that climate change is approached in this administration. But, Matt, you said something, and I think what's coming out of this conversation is if we live in a democracy, it's really important that we have some sort of foundational facts through which we can engage in deliberative discussion about. So actually unfortunately I used those two words back to back because I want to differentiate them. There's a difference between discussion and deliberation. Deliberation is you're going back and forth about different opinions and arguments about an issue, and you're hoping to try to come to some sort of new understanding, a new vantage point by which you can now deal with an issue. Whereas a discussion is kind of just like, let's talk. Let's talk about it, and let's just kind of, here's what maybe discussion is more about emotion. Here's just kind of what I feel, here's what I think, and that's just kind of, the way it is. I'm not sure I'm parsing those as best as I could, but the point is, my point is that in a democracy, we want to have deliberative dialogue that are based on some set of facts. And if we're only talking about hopes and fears and emotions, then I don't think we're going to get very far in a sustainable way for our society. So I would agree that, I think Mark Turnbull here is kind of correct. Yeah, maybe a lot of our politics is run by hopes and fears, but I would hope that he could use the advertising potential he has through Cambridge Analytica to try to maybe promote fact-based.
Like combat against that sort of gut level thinking? Yeah.
As opposed to just saying, well, this is the way it is, and let's contribute to that. Let's contribute to the hopes and fears, and that's the whole point, right? That's the whole point of how the psychographics information is used, is to target your hopes and fears and to make you react about something, not on a factual basis, but just to make you have a jerk reaction. There's one other clip from Channel 4 that I think is definitely worth playing. And this one is talking about what is information that Cambridge Analytica is using. What is that? Is that actual political advertising? Is it disinformation and fake news? Or is it expressly propaganda? And let's hear what Mark Turnbull has to say.
Lies a code of conduct.
So we're not in the business of fake news. We're not in the business of lying, making stuff up, and we're not in the business of entrapment. So we wouldn't send a pretty girl out to seduce a politician and then film them in their bedroom and then release the film. There are companies that do this, but to me that crosses a line.
Again, that was Mark Turnbull from Cambridge Analytica, and he's saying we're not in the business of fake news, and that they wouldn't use perhaps slanderous or unethical practices by which they can
entrapment, he said.
Entrap people. And it is worth noting that if you watch that full clip from Channel 4, that Alexander Nix, the former CEO of Cambridge Analytica, in a follow-up meeting, one of the things he said was like, we could send pretty girls to politicians and try to entrap them.
Describes exactly what Mark Turnbull said he wouldn't do, and says he would do it.
Yeah, and that's coming from the CEO of the company. So, it's hard to tell what exactly their policy is, but they are pretty harsh on saying, well, I guess he's saying we're not fake news. And, I imagine that it depends on what your definition of fake news is nowadays, of course. It has quickly meant to mean anything you disagree with, perhaps. But there's one last clip from Channel 4, I think, and it has to deal with Mark Turnbull and propaganda, and whether Channel 4 is dealing with propaganda.
Outed discreetly, he goes on to say, at the right moment. Whatever the political message, subtlety is key.
It has to happen without anyone thinking that's propaganda. Because the moment you think that's propaganda, the next question is, who's put that out?
Yes.
So we have to be very subtle.
And
has to happen without anyone thinking it's propaganda. Matt or Graham, what do you think about that? Here's this organization, here's Cambridge Analytica. Its job is to gather data about people, to use that data to create psychographic profiles, and then to use those profiles to target people, to micro-target them with advertisements.
It's very concerning to me that he phrased it that way, that we can't let people think it's propaganda. Just the way that he phrased that, to me, implies that even he is thinking about it as propaganda to a certain extent. Because if it wasn't at all propaganda, the information that they're putting out there, why would he be concerned about that?
Mm-hmm.
That's just my first reaction to that clip.
Yeah, I agree, and I talked with you a little bit about this over the week, Jason, but would like to also mention that he seems very concerned about people wondering where it came from and sort of it leading back to him. And I feel like if you're doing something that's legitimate, that's just not a concern you would have if people found out like where your information was coming from.
Yeah, so not only is he saying, like, we don't want people to think this is propaganda, he's saying we don't want people to question where they're getting their information from. And that, to me, is the biggest problem for all of this, is because I would hope that in a democracy, and I have said this many times in the show before, I hope that you're taking what I'm saying right now critically. I hope that you're thinking about the veracity and the truth of the things that we're all talking about, and I hope that you question those things and somehow fit them into your worldview, whether it confirms your worldview, extends your worldview, or challenges your worldview. I hope you're doing some combination of all of that. And I think that there's a strong argument you can make that there is a whole other world out there almost that is sort of run by shadowy money that you can't track. Money that is controlled by people who have exorbitant amounts of money and exorbitant amounts of power and are able to use the rules of the system to have their money wield tremendous power. For example, Cambridge Analytica is only possible as a shell company because the political economic system allows shell companies to exist, meaning companies that you can't really figure out who owns them, who runs them, who operates them, and you can't really track all the dollars that they're using.
I think they got a large sum of money to start their work back in 2014 or 2015 from a billionaire hedge fund manager.
You're right.
Robert Mercer.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. Yep, and Robert and Rebecca Mercer, like the Koch brothers, are exorbitantly wealthy people who, we said in the last show, tend to support libertarian points of view because if you live in a society with a weak and limited government, then if you have a lot of money, then your money has a lot more power. Because the purpose of a government is to try to balance the scales for all of its constituents, for all the people. And
well, that's your perspective.
Sure.
That's my perspective too. But
sure. Well, I would hope that a lot of people share a perspective where the government is supposed to provide for the people. I understand that's not a universal perspective, but if you have a lot of money, though, a weak government is typically in your interests, so long as it continues to serve, the power of money.
A weak government domestically, but for a group like the Koch brothers and the interests they represent, it's also very important to have really strong military forces so that they can, go overseas and squash the competition in the oil industry and fossil fuels.
And the military consumes a lot of oil.
That it does.
Yeah, that's a good point. So all this is getting to the notion of we should be critical of where we're getting our information from. And if we log on to Facebook and Facebook's algorithms are targeting advertisements to us, and we can't tell who paid for those advertisements, why we're seeing those advertisements, it's up to us as the individual consumer to somehow have the capacity to judge the veracity of those claims. And I'm a busy guy. All of us are pretty busy. And I feel like in society, a lot of the burden is always placed on consumers, individuals. And I have a problem with that, at least, because more and more I feel like things are just like, things become, if something's wrong, it's probably your fault for not taking advantage and really doing your homework and pulling up your bootstraps and getting things done.
There's a phrase for that. It's called victim blaming.
Yeah. That's right. So how much do we put the blame on the victim? How much do we put the blame on the system? For example, back in the 2008 global financial crisis, do you put the blame on the individuals who took the mortgage loans? Do you say that they didn't have enough financial literacy to understand that they couldn't afford those loans and the annual interest rates and how much money they made and all the rest of the financial jargon? Or do you blame the system and the people who created those loans, knowing that in all likelihood people couldn't pay them back and they were using complicated financial instruments to allow them to make more money off of faulty loans? Of course, the answer probably lies somewhere in between, but oftentimes I feel like more of the blame is placed unfairly on individuals.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's very American of us to do, to blame the individual. That the idea of rugged individualism and taking personal responsibility both for the good that you have in your life and the bad is very American.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah. to give like an example I often use, it's like if somebody breaks into your car, do you blame the person who stole from you, or do you blame yourself for like forgetting to lock the door? You know, like oftentimes I think people don't want to think that bad things can happen to them, that they have some measure of control and that things are preventable. So, you know, as long as I remember to lock my door at night, nobody will break into my house or my car. But people shouldn't steal.
Right. And the culture has a large role to play in that. I mean, to my knowledge, 30, 40, 50 years ago, let's say, at least in some neighborhoods and parts of the country, I think locking the door wasn't as common as it is nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
That's at least kind of what I heard from older folks. And they say, yeah, I mean, when I was younger, you could leave your bike unchained next to a pole and it'd be there when you got back or something. But now it's different. And I don't know how much that has to connect with our conversation, but it's something, culture definitely has an impact. Collective consciousness, collective feelings. Back to hopes and fears.
Yeah. To bring it back into Cambridge Analytica and the critical analysis of these quasi-propaganda political advertisements that they're pushing out, I think it becomes incredibly difficult to blame the individual for failing to recognize that was, you know, fake news or propaganda or whatever you want to call what Cambridge Analytica was doing, when people until recently were just largely very uninformed about this whole issue. You know, not only is the American public, I think, generally unprepared by our education systems to engage in critical analysis on a constant basis, but when you don't know that you need to do that in the first place, like when you see just like a screen-filling political ad about, you know, crooked Hillary or anything like that, how are you supposed to know?
That's a great point. Like, why is it the onus of responsibility placed on the viewer when there are people out there who are deliberately trying to mislead other people or whatever? And going back to this, Jason, did you want to talk about, I think it was Senator Orrin Hatch who said something about this in the Zuckerberg testimony?
Yeah, let's transition into Mark Zuckerberg's testimony this week. Again, after this story broke and became sort of mainstream, where people started to be like, oh, this is a thing I need to care about, Mark Zuckerberg was called in to testify in front of Congress. He tried to back out of that and say, well, maybe I don't need to. Maybe I can send one of my associates. But he did testify this week in front of three congressional committees, I think, and 2 hearings. And it was about 10 hours of testifying. And there was a lot of really interesting things to come out of that. And one of them was there's a lot of questions from senators that were asked, and Orrin Hatch in particular. He is a conservative senator who I believe is maybe retiring at this year. He served for a long time.
Yes, he is retiring.
Yeah, he's a conservative guy. He generally believes in individualism, I think in free markets, sort of the core conservative values. And he started off his questioning to Mark Zuckerberg by saying, you know, we haven't had such a focused, interrogative questioning on a sort of an organization since some Microsoft scandal. And he just said that, I find it odd that people would think that when they use a free service like Facebook, that they're not giving up anything. And he was basically saying, like, look, if you're not paying for something, you're the product. And he said that should be fairly self-explanatory for folks. But, you know, I hold a different point of view than Orrin Hatch, and we'll hear a clip actually from the testimony from Mark Zuckerberg. Real quick, though, I wanted to remind everyone that if you're just joining us, that you're listening to WXIR here in Rochester, New York on 100.9 FM. You can stream us live on air at 109wxir.com. And folks, you can always email us throughout the show at evidenceofdesign@gmail.com. Let me back that up. evidenceofdesign101@gmail.com. Someone already took evidenceofdesign@gmail.com. I was pretty mad about that, so had to throw a 101 on there. All right. evidenceofdesign101@gmail.com. Please give us an email throughout the show. We'd love to hear from you. Or give us a call, 585-219-8889. I can talk, folks. I can talk. Today we're talking about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and why all this matters. And we're trying to get into sort of the weeds with all these implications. And let us now hear something. This is sort of the most important point I found from the testimony that I listened to from Mark Zuckerberg. It is Mark Zuckerberg responding to John Cornyn from Texas, and let us hear what Mark Zuckerberg had to say.
Delete your account, we should get rid of all of your information.
You should, or
We do.
you?
We do.
How about third parties that you have contracted with to use some of that underlying information, perhaps to target advertising for themselves? You can't. Do you claw back that information as well, or does that remain in their custody?
Well, Senator, this is actually a very important question. I'm glad you brought this up because there's a very common misperception about Facebook that we sell data to advertisers. And we do not sell data to advertisers.
Well,
we don't sell data to anyone.
You clearly rent it.
What we allow is for advertisers to tell us who they want to reach, and then we do the placement. So if an advertiser comes to us and says, all right, I'm a ski shop and I want to sell skis to women, then we might have some sense because people shared skiing-related content or said they were interested in that. They shared whether they're a woman, and then we can show the ads to the right people without that data ever changing hands and going to the advertiser. That's a very fundamental part of how our model works and something that is often misunderstood, so I appreciate that you brought that up.
Thank you, Senator.
All right, so that was Mark Zuckerberg testifying, I think, this Wednesday to Senator John Cornyn from Texas, asking really about how is data and advertising used from Facebook. Was there anything that jumped out to you, Graham? I don't know if you heard any of the testimony. Did any of that shock you at all? What were your reactions?
Well, so Mark Zuckerberg keeps talking about, and this was a theme throughout the testimony from the little bits and pieces of it that I've seen, that they don't sell data to advertisers. They provide a service to advertisers. And to me, that says they don't sell data, they sell access to data and information. And I guess there's a slight difference there, but I don't know, to me it kind of seems like the same thing almost. And that seemed like a little, seemed like Mark Zuckerberg trying to get out of the trouble that he found himself in at the Senate and the House hearings.
Yeah, what I heard from that was that Mark Zuckerberg is saying, we do not give your data to companies. What we do is companies come to us with their advertisement and their targeted population, and then we pair their advertisement with their targeted population with the data we have about you. That's what I heard from Mark Zuckerberg there. I don't know the truth of what's going on because you're hearing it from the CEO of the guy who started the company. However, we do know that in the Cambridge Analytica case, this is not what happened, and this is why Facebook is getting their torches and pitchforks about it, because they can throw those at Cambridge Analytica and say, they broke our rules. This is not how the system's supposed to work. Alexander Kogan, when he created the app to gather people's data, that was totally fine within the rules of what Facebook was doing back in 2014, but Alexander Kogan sold the data to Cambridge Analytica for $800 million, something like $800,000. I don't know whatever it was, but he got monetary compensation. He sold the data to Cambridge Analytica, and that is what broke the rules and why Facebook has some ammunition to target them and say, hey, we're not angry about the data, right? The data and how it was acquired was fine. We're angry that you sold the data because Facebook wants a monopoly on the data, I think, because that's their revenue.
Yeah, that's their business model.
Mm-hmm.
But what's concerning about that is what Cambridge Analytica did was what Alexander Kogan did was get access to about a couple 100,000 people's data through Facebook, and then through those couple 100,000 people got access to all of their friend group networks.
Mm-hmm.
And the people that participated in, I think it was a survey that he used to get access to that original couple 100,000 people, they consented to giving their data to him by taking the survey, but their friend groups didn't. And that was something that Facebook allowed.
Right.
And
I think
he wasn't the first one to do that. He wasn't the only one to do that.
Yeah, the story broke, but and Facebook has said that since then they have changed sort of the architecture of Facebook to keep this sort of thing from happening again. But we don't know. This was the way things were for years. We don't know how many other people took advantage of this.
Mm-hmm.
We just know because of this story breaking that it was used in this particular case. But the vast majority of people who had their data taken did so without even knowing about it,
Mm-hmm.
without even coming into contact with This Is My Digital Life, the app that Alexander Kogan created. I don't know if that's illegal, but it should be, in my opinion, because seems like such an illegitimate way to go about doing this sort of thing, this data collection.
It wasn't illegal at the time because, Facebook is, and social media in general, basically the whole internet is still largely unregulated when it comes to these types of things. It's still a very, very new
frontier.
Yeah. And I know I don't fully have my head wrapped around it, and I can't imagine that most of America does, let alone our politicians.
That was another takeaway. I haven't done nearly as much looking at the Zuckerberg testimony as I would have liked to, but sort of from what I gathered, from what I saw, it seemed like the senators themselves didn't have the knowledge of this sort of thing. And to some extent, how can you expect them to? It's such a complicated system that even Mark Zuckerberg doesn't seem to be able to adequately know or describe it at times. But they didn't have the know-how to sort of pin him down and ask the questions that I felt really needed to be asked, from what I gathered. And that's from my very limited viewing of the testimony.
I agree. Here's a question, though. We've all, as a society, seemed to be okay with getting targeted advertising. We can use banal examples like a ski shop, as Mark Zuckerberg said. If I am a woman who likes to ski,
and you've shared that you're a woman,
and if I've shared with Facebook that I'm a woman, and somehow I've liked things that make them think that I like to ski, then is it okay to get advertisements about skiing? And we all seem to be okay with that. Would I rather see ads that have to do with things I like, or ads that I don't care about? We all kind of agree with that. I'm a little more on the wary side. I actually have issues with that, but most folks seem to be okay with that.
I think that's an important point to make, but the flip side of getting targeted advertising is sharing all these things about yourself with Facebook, and through doing that with all of the companies and organizations that Facebook then, uses your data to help target advertising. And that's something I think people just don't know about. We all go and click, yes, I'll agree to share my data, but I don't know what data I'm sharing exactly when I click those things. Something I learned recently is when you say you log into another app like Spotify with your Facebook account, you then share all of your data, all of your data from Facebook with Spotify.
Yep.
And vice versa. And that's something that, that's something I think most people just don't know about.
There was something recently about Android phones sharing your contacts list with Facebook, and now Facebook has control, or at least it did, would be able to access your call history from up to a year ago or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, and that's been, the collection of as much data as possible, and then the sharing of it with all these different entities. That's been the goal of Facebook since they started. They've wanted to collect as much as they can, because that's where they get their power from. That's where they make their money. And I don't think this is the first time Mark Zuckerberg has been called into question about collecting data.
No.
Definitely not.
And making mistakes with it. One part of the hearing that I listened to was, I think it was a congresswoman. I can't remember her name or the context of the testimony, but she was reading off the number of times in the last 12, 13 years that Mark Zuckerberg has come to Congress and apologized. And it was almost once a year.
Wow.
For some sort of mistake that he made, that Facebook made.
I had no idea that he'd been. Was it the same sort of testimony setup?
Yeah.
I had no idea that had happened. I thought this was the first time that he'd actually been called to.
I'm sorry. Maybe it wasn't the same sort of testimony setup, but he has apologized repeatedly on behalf of Facebook.
Yeah, I don't think he's ever testified in the same capacity that he has this time. I can't speak to the types of testimony.
I would just like to say real quick that I don't have a problem necessarily with having advertisements for things that I like music equipment or albums, stuff that I'm interested in. But I see how accurate it can be sometimes, and I wonder what else is being recorded about me. What other trails am I leaving with my digital footprint? What else can people glean from my activity online? And it seems really difficult to know exactly what that is.
And to bring it back to that whole idea of personal responsibility and individualism, that's so American. That's what Zuckerberg was saying, is that people opt into this. Like they opt into this when they go on Facebook, and it's up to them to opt out of sharing all of their data. And that, I think that's where another significant problem lies. That all of the responsibility for, choosing where your data goes is on the individual to stop rather than to participate in. You just simply participate by being a part of Facebook. And being a part of Facebook is almost just a fact of life for many people at this point.
That's a really good point. It's grown so exponentially in the past couple of years. It's become so ubiquitous. I think on our last show, Jason, you said that something like 80% of American adults with internet access, regular access to the internet, have some sort of social media presence.
Yeah,
an account
Facebook,
on Facebook or Twitter or something. And because it's been adopted so quickly and by so many people, it's really hard to sort of imagine or even to think about like how to function without it. I mean, I keep track of friend groups of events happening around town through Facebook. That's primarily how I find out that things are happening in the city. I don't really. I suppose there are other ways to do that. There's local newspapers, but it's very convenient. It's very easy, and it would be quite the adjustment to just sort of opt out of and totally cut myself off from at this point. And I also would like to just point out that I signed up for Facebook when I was a teenager. I was like 15 years old.
Me too.
I had no concept, no way of knowing like anything like this would happen, and I don't think that anybody should expect like what is essentially a child to know or understand the consequences of like what their activity online could be. I think that's a very sort of, I don't know, it's just not like a very responsible view to take, I think.
Absolutely. So listeners, this is Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR. We are talking today about Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, and why all of this matters in this story. And I'd like to spend, Matt and Graham, I'd like to spend the rest of our time here talking about what do we do? What do we do about this? Graham, you brought up education, and is education failing us? What is the role of education? What do we do as a society to collectively decide what is ethical with the use of our data, and how do we understand the truth or falsehood of certain claims in advertising? Real quick, though, listeners, I wanted to point out one thing, that if you listen to the testimony, something I gleaned from Mark Zuckerberg's responses is that most of his proposed solutions to the problems being presented to him with Facebook from the questionings from the senators was that Zuckerberg frequently said, well, we are developing new AI tools that will hopefully help fight these problems. For example, multiple times he said that terroristic content is taken down on Facebook real quickly after it's put up because Facebook has AI that can go in and tell when something is terroristic content, and they can remove that. Mark Zuckerberg also said hate speech. They're trying to get better at developing AI to remove hate speech. They said that's difficult because hate speech manifests differently. I guess terroristic content does as well, but I don't understand how that works.
Why one is easy and one isn't.
Yep. And there was also like fake news. So the truth and falsehood of news. Mark Zuckerberg said they're trying to develop new AI tools to ascertain when misinformation is spread. Those are his proposed solutions, and they are not systemic. They do not solve the systemic issues in my mind. They are not talking about the moral and ethical obligations that the company has on how we use data. They are not talking about the moral and ethical obligations of political organizations that can use targeted advertising. They're saying, let me develop this technological solution in terms of advertisements. I'm sorry, not advertisements. AI, artificial intelligence. The problem with AI is that AI is built upon certain rules, and we as the average American individual consumer can't tell what the rules of the AI are. So every time we type something into Google and something pops up on the search result, we don't know why that's coming up there. We don't know how the AI works. And that is really important. And this is why I have a problem with the targeted advertising, because it is using what's called filter bubbles. You only ever see the same things over and over that are in your own worldview. So AI, the way AI is constructed, perhaps, is just continually reconstructing filter bubbles that only ever make you see the things that you're interested in. How will you ever be exposed to people who are different than you and who have different ideas and with different products if the AI is simply saying, this is the way things are, and let us sort of throw things at you? So I'd love to go into more of that. That could be a whole another show, how AI works nowadays. But perhaps let's focus our attention. Our last 12 minutes here, we will solve this problem. We will solve this right here now in Evidence of Design. This will be a historic moment. What do we do? What is our role? How do we, in a democracy,
Wow, I didn't expect that.
deal with this?
I'm excited to find out, though. What's the answer, Jason?
Well, Matt, I was hoping you'd talk about it with me. Let's discuss and figure this out.
Well, I think it, that Mark Zuckerberg has come and proposed these fixes is a good thing, I think. But I don't think it's nearly enough. And it, again, it kind of speaks again to me to this trend we have in America of asking for-profit entities, companies and corporations to self-regulate.
Police themselves.
To police themselves. And I don't think it's, well, sure, it's possible, but I don't think it's successful at all. Because if Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook are truly going to change what they're doing, that affects their bottom line, their ability to make a profit.
Absolutely.
So I think it really is the responsibility of the government, which represents, or at least is supposed to represent, the interests of the people, to come up with some sort of regulation on how data can be shared and gathered by these, digital entities, these social media platforms, these internet machines out there.
Yeah, but are you okay with information being used, are you okay with your information being used to create targeted political advertising?
That's a more difficult question. Because, like you said, with these AIs, it separates, people with different political ideas and keeps us from viewing things that might challenge our ideas. So, but at the same time, I like my bubble.
Bubble's comfortable.
So I don't know. I don't have an answer to that.
I mean, theoretically, like anything, you could use this ability for good. You could make targeted ads that are factual and based in, observable truth that target people who perhaps need to have their worldview challenged. But if you open that door, you give equal opportunity to people to abuse that power. And I don't know that I'm comfortable with that, honestly. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've seen... So, we don't know exactly. We don't know how effective Cambridge Analytica's tactics were. But just the fact that they tried, that there were people out there that were deliberately trying to manipulate people with false information, that's scary. That should be something that everybody who's involved in this democracy should care about. And if you live in America, you're involved. Whether you vote or not, whether you have any political leanings or opinions or not, you are involved.
Cambridge Analytica did this on behalf of right-wing operatives in America, but Russia did something very similar. They used bots and AIs to target political advertising on a number of social media platforms for their own purposes in our last election. And that's horrifying. Mm-hmm. That's a foreign entity interfering in the democratic process of our American elections.
Mm-hmm. And that's a huge point, because this is all part of a much larger discussion. I don't know if Cambridge Analytica trafficked in the spread of fake news. We know Russia did. That's empirically proven, unless you're the president of the United States who is questioning whether or not that happened. But we know that Russia trafficked in misinformation on purpose, because Russia doesn't like democracy. Russia likes money and consolidated power.
Well, Putin.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Nothing against the Russian people, obviously. Yeah, but, Putin, the Russian government, has no love for democracy. So we have so many different levels here. We have foreign governments who are using data to spread misinformation through platforms such as Facebook. We have foreign companies who create shell companies in the United States funded by wealthy Republicans to further their own agenda. And by the way, this happens on the left too. I mean, the left is not excused from this at all.
No.
There's larger questions of like, how do we use data and what is ethical about it? And I think that's kind of at the meat of the matter. So how do we become media literate?
Well, you sort of asked this question last time too, Jason.
Yeah.
And I gave you a response that was something like, you need to read a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to read not just news sources, but books, research articles.
And you need to become aware of how people use the data that you put out, what data you're putting out to people, and how that affects what you see. You have to learn about how your bubble is made, so to speak.
Mm.
And there are ways to find out. Like, there's been a lot of discussion recently about tracking, your digital footprint because of this scandal. I know, Jason, you sent me the show of a local radio station just this week that had a guest that sort of talked about that. And so, I mean, not to take the position that people are responsible for knowing how their data is being used, but we can find out to some degree, and I think we should definitely be trying to.
Yeah, and I think that figuring out how our data is used, and learning about this in general as a public is the first step to having a discussion about what to do about it. I think that that's the first step to solving any real problem that a large group of people faces. Just all getting to the same level of understanding about what the problem is.
Mm. We have to have the same set of facts.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yes.
It's like when people are divided and there's a separate facts depending on what you want to believe. That's where the difficulty lies.
Same set of facts. So maybe our last point to discuss about here is, I'm no scholar on media education, on media literacy. I've done some reading in the field, and there's one article, came out in 2017 last year, and it's titled "Educating for Democracy in a Partisan Age, Confronting the Challenges of Motivated Reasoning and Misinformation." So it's an academic article, and in it lays out sort of a theoretical framework that the authors argue is common in the critical media field. The two ways to process information, the article says, is there's directional motivation and then accuracy motivation. So directional motivation is the much more powerful and important way that we tend to process information. And the directional motivation says, if there's something that already agrees with my worldview, I'm much more likely to accept that information and not have to think critically about it. If there's something that challenges my worldview, I'm immediately going to latch onto that and think a lot more critically about that. So directional motivation is the most common way and perhaps the most powerful way that people process information. The other way is this accuracy motivation. That's you thinking all the time about the stuff that you're getting inputted into your brain and trying to mobilize cognitive resources to wonder what those things are. Obviously, that's exhausting and, quite frankly, probably impossible all the time. So here's the point, though, from the article. The point is, they found, the authors of this article, that in a study they did, that the more political knowledge you have, the more susceptible you are to succumbing to the vices of directional motivation. So the more political knowledge you have, the more you're able to willingly accept things that you agree with.
That's funny.
That is counterintuitive.
I think it makes a lot of sense, actually.
Interesting. And let me just finish up one point, and then Graham, definitely please respond. So the authors argued then, instead of promoting political knowledge, we should instead be promoting critical literacy, whatever that means. So, Graham, what were you going to say?
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. I look at myself. I've spent, the last 5 years gathering and learning about politics, but specifically leftward-leaning politics. Mm-hmm. And given that extensive somewhat extensive political knowledge I already have. I know that I'm much more likely to agree with an article from Vox than an article from the Wall Street Journal. I recognize that about myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you don't already have those political biases cemented within yourself, it's much more easy to just look at something for what it is, to look at it as at an accuracy level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That is interesting.
I also don't know how much I agree with. I mean, I definitely agree with the conclusion of the article in that we need more critical literacy, but for a democracy to function, I think that there has to be some level of agreement within the population about certain types of political ideas and political knowledge. If we have a group of people that are so drastically separated on the political spectrum, it's much more difficult to come to a consensus, especially if those two groups are completely cemented in their biases.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that is, teaching people that critical analysis, those skills. But the other part is, kind of realigning our own political knowledge and where our country falls on the spectrum.
Yeah. We have about 2 minutes here. Graham, I don't want to just say I agree. I agree. Matt, let's end with why is this important? Why is the conversation about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and the use of our data important? Matt, what do you think?
You want me to give my response that I gave you last night?
I want you to give the response that you feel to be true.
Okay. So, real quick. I've talked with a couple people over the week about this, and the responses that I've got ranged from I don't know what that's about to I don't really care to any multitude of them. But you should care, because even if what Cambridge Analytica didn't have any sort of major effect on the election, the fact remains that there's a very high likelihood that your personal information was used to make ads, to manipulate people into thinking a certain way, to feel a certain way, to influence an election. And the people who made those ads shouldn't have access to that information without your consent. And I imagine that I know that most of the people who had their data stolen didn't give consent, and that's just messed up. It's messed up.
And also the fact that politicians are using this data who probably don't have your best interests in mind.
Yeah, Ted Cruz was on the Zuckerberg testimony panel, and nobody mentioned that he was the guy who originally hired Cambridge Analytica.
That was a little odd.
Yeah.
I don't know if they were asking the right questions, but folks, that is all the time that we have. We never get to everything that we want to talk about. I really wanted to spend a lot of this episode on what critical literacy is, the different types of critical literacy, strategies we can use as a society to be critically literate, but maybe we'll get to that next time. You are listening to Evidence of Design. I was joined by my good friend today, Graham Hughes and Matt Treadwell.
Goodbye.
We will be back next week, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester, New York. Thanks for listening, everyone. Be safe, be well. Bye-bye.